I was actually just walking through the grocery store the other day, staring at the price of eggs. Again.
Oh, yeah, it's rough out there.
Right. And then right after that, I checked my phone and saw the stock market hitting, yet another all-time high. It creates this very specific, really frustrating cognitive dissonance. It feels like the economy is just split in two.
Yeah, you are describing the classic K-shaped recovery, or, I mean, at this point, just the K-shaped economy.
Exactly, the letter K. One arm goes straight up. So wealth keeps compounding, asset prices skyrocket, and if you own stuff, life is honestly great.
Right.
But then the other arm goes down, wages stagnate, purchasing power evaporates, and if you work for a living, you feel like you're running on a treadmill that someone just keeps cranking up the speed on.
Yep, the incline keeps rising.
And the natural reaction to that, the one I feel right in my gut, is to just throw my hands up and say, the system is broken.
Which is the most common sentiment I hear. You hear it everywhere, right? The system is rigged or the machine is malfunctioning. But here is where we have to start today's deep dive with a bit of a hard pivot.
Yeah.
And I really need you to stay with me on this because it changes how you see absolutely everything.
Okay, lay it on me.
The system isn't broken.
I mean, that is a really tough sell for the people on the bottom arm of that K. It certainly feels broken.
It feels that way, absolutely.
Yeah.
The pain is very real. But if we look at this from a design perspective, a system is simply a machine that produces outputs based on its inputs and its incentives.
Right, like an algorithm.
Exactly. Charlie Munger had that famous line, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. So if we are seeing extreme wealth concentration and this massive divide between the old and the young, that isn't a glitch. That is the system producing the exact output it is currently incentivized to produce.
That is somehow more terrifying than it being broken.
Right.
Because broken implies, an accident. Designed implies intent.
It implies a set of decisions, and that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We are doing a deep dive into a really fascinating body of work called the System Series, specifically Demographics, Decisions, and Destiny, Part 1.
And that's by Aquavis, right? So we get the pronunciation right. That's Aquavis.
Correct, Aquavis. And if you're watching the video version, you'll see we've got that deep navy and teal Aquavis vibe going on today. But their work entirely focuses on this concept of system design.
So the mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. We want to stop just reacting to the headlines, the symptoms of the K-shape, and actually map the cycle.
Right. We want to look at the source code. Because if you want to understand why things feel the way they do today, you can't just look at today.
You have to look at the initial conditions.
Exactly. We have to walk chronologically through the birth of the U.S.-led system after World War II, trace it through the booming 80s and 90s, and identify the exact moment, the inflection point, where the design changed from a mindset of abundance to one of scarcity.
And spoiler alert for everyone listening, that inflection point is much later than people think. So let's rewind the tape. Let's go all the way back to 1945. The war is over. The dust is settling. What does the game board actually look like?
It looks like a one-player game. We really tend to forget just how absolute the American dominance was in 1945. The United States wasn't just a superpower, it was the power.
Yeah, the stats from the Aquavis research are honestly staggering.
They are. The U.S. held over 50% of the entire world's productive capacity.
Wait, pause on that for a second. Half of everything the human race can make, like steel, cars, radios, half of it was being made in America.
And it gets crazier. The U.S. controlled over 60% of global oil production and held over 50% of the world's gold reserves.
So total dominance. You have the factories, the fuel, and the money.
Total. And this brings us to the core framework Aquavis uses, which is crucial for this whole discussion. They call it the 3 pillars of power.
Okay, let's break those down.
Sure. So if you want to be the hegemon, the absolute leader of the system, you need 3 things. First, you need technology. Specifically, asymmetric technology.
Like the atomic bomb in 45. The big stick.
Right, the ultimate asymmetric advantage. But technology needs power to run. You can't just have ideas. So the second pillar is energy.
Makes sense.
And finally, you need to fund the research, the extraction, the distribution. So the third pillar is money, technology, energy, money. And in 1945, the U.S. had a total monopoly on all 3.
So here is the fundamental question. You have all the marbles. You have all the money, all the oil, all the tech. The logical, historically normal human thing to do is to hoard it.
To crush everyone else and stay on top forever.
Yeah, that's what the Romans would have done. That's what the British Empire tried to do.
Exactly. But that's not what happened. And this is the most surprising part of the initial design of the post-war system. The U.S. chose a growth mindset.
They chose abundance.
Yes. They looked at the ruins of Europe and Asia and decided that a world of customers was ultimately better than a world of subjects.
Which is basically the Marshall Plan approach.
It is, but it goes a lot deeper than just sending foreign aid. Look at the trade policy. The source material highlights this beautifully. Back in the 1930s, U.S. tariffs were hovering around 20%. We were highly protectionist.
Right.
But after the war, the U.S. effectively tariffed itself. They dropped tariffs to near zero, specifically to let the rest of the world sell things to America.
They intentionally lowered their own production dominance. I mean, on paper, that seems incredibly counterintuitive.
It was a huge strategic gamble. The explicit goal was to rebalance the world. They wanted U.S. production to go down relative to the global total and U.S. consumption to go up.
They wanted Germany, Japan, and later places like South Korea and Taiwan to rebuild their industries.
Exactly. It was a positive-sum game. The core logic was, if we grow the pie, everyone is better off. Even if our slice gets relatively smaller, the whole pie is so much bigger that we still win.
And it worked. The global economy just exploded.
It worked brilliantly. It was a system literally designed for abundance. But, and this is a big but systems don't just run on abstract economics. They run on people. And specifically, they run on generations.
Which brings us to the next major driver in the Aquavi's framework demographics. Or, as they put it, the pig and the python.
I love that classic analogy. The pig is the baby boomer generation, this absolutely massive population cohort born right after the war, and the python is the timeline of history.
So as this huge group moves through time, the physical system has to stretch and shift to accommodate them.
Perfectly said. And the government didn't just sit back and watch this happen. They actively paved the way for this generation.
Yeah, you had things like the GI Bill, which was really a policy created by the lost generation, the missionary generation, the parents of the boomers, to make sure their kids didn't suffer the way they did during the Depression.
Exactly. Free education, no down payment mortgages. It fiercely nurtured the family unit. But the big one, the policy that really shaped the physical world we live in today, was the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956.
Which is fascinating because I always thought that was just about making it easier to drive cross-country or maybe moving military tanks around if the Soviets invaded.
Well, that was the pitch to Congress, right? National security, moving product and military assets quickly. But the economic intent was much deeper. The Aquavi's piece calls it a two birds, one stone policy.
Because by building the roads, you effectively created the suburbs.
Exactly. And if you live in the suburbs, you can't just walk to work or take a quick trolley.
You need a car. You need gas. You need to furnish a much larger home with a yard.
It boosted the auto industry, the oil industry, the construction industry, and appliance manufacturing all at once.
It's connecting the pillars again. Energy and technology fueling the economy.
Precisely. And it proves a major point in the source material demographics are influenceable. You can't change geography. But if you enact long-term policy that makes it easy to buy a home and drive a car, people will have families.
So decisions made in the 50s determined the destiny of the 70s and 80s. The system was nurturing the pig while it was young. That's right.
Okay, so the system is humming along. The U.S. is rebuilding the world. The boomers are growing up in these new suburbs. But then we hit 1971. And the source marks this as the first crack in the foundation.
1971 is a massive pivot point. This is the Nixon shock, the moment the U.S. officially went off the gold standard.
Okay, let's unpack this carefully. Because I feel like I hear about 1971 all the time on the internet. It's pointed to as the root of all modern evil. Was it just pure greed?
It wasn't just greed. It was actually a mathematical necessity of the system they designed back in 1945. Think about it. The design was to let the rest of the world catch up.
Right.
Well, they did. Global trade was expanding so fast and the world was generating so much wealth that there literally wasn't enough physical gold in the world to back all the dollars needed to facilitate that trade.
So the global economy essentially outgrew the physical gold supply. Exactly. In economics, it's called the Triffin dilemma. The U.S. had ignored Keynes's advice for a neutral reserve currency and doubled down on the U.S. dollar. They needed to supply the world with more money, more capital to fund global growth. But gold is finite.
So they had to make a switch. The dollar would no longer be backed by a shiny rock. It would be backed by U.S. debt treasuries.
Right. And this sounds like the moment where everything goes wrong. This is where people usually say, that's it, that's when the reckless money printing started.
Yeah, that's the standard narrative.
And they aren't entirely wrong, but there is a crucial distinction here that the WWII series points out. And if you miss this, You missed the whole story.
Okay, what is it?
1971 created the capability to print money exponentially. It removed the gold governor from the engine, but, and this is vital, that capability wasn't fully exploited immediately.
So they bought the gun, but they didn't pull the trigger.
Not yet. Because the feedback loop was still intact. In the 70s and 80s, if the U.S. made bad economic decisions, the market still punished them. It was painful. We saw that very clearly with the energy crisis in the 70s.
Right, the OPEC embargo, gas lines wrapping around the block.
Exactly. The U.S. had let its energy pillar weaken. They became heavily dependent on foreign oil. Adversaries saw that vulnerability and squeezed it hard. Inflation absolutely skyrocketed.
But what happened next is the key part. The U.S. didn't just print its way out of the problem.
No, they actually responded to reality. They created the Department of Energy to focus on efficiency and domestic supply. Paul Volcker came in and raised interest rates to almost 20% to kill the inflation.
20% interest rates. Imagine that today.
It would break the world today. But back then, they took the pain. They reasserted control. The discipline of the system was still there.
So the system was heavily stressed, but the foundation held.
It held. And taking that medicine set the stage for what the source calls the Golden Age.
The 1980s and 1990s. The boomers are all grown up now.
The pig has moved right into the productive middle part of the python. The boomers entered the workforce in massive numbers. And just as policy favored them when they were kids with new schools and suburbs, policy shifted to favor them as workers.
This is where we see those massive tax cuts, right? Favoring labor.
Huge tax cuts. The top income tax rate dropped from over 70% down to under 30%. And interest rates. They peaked in 1981 and then basically went straight down for the next 40 years.
Which made credit incredibly cheap.
Exactly. And housing was still affordable. Supply ballooned to meet demand. Back then, the home price-to-income ratio was around 4.
Meaning a house cost about 4 times the average annual salary?
Right. Today, it's double that, or worse, depending on the city. But if you were a worker in the 80s or 90s, the economic wind was entirely at your back.
And the source uses a great joke here to describe this period. They call it the NSYNC era.
I definitely laughed at that. But the underlying metric is very real and very important. During this period, the growth of capital meaning money and assets, and the growth of labor meaning wages and jobs were basically in sync.
The ratio of capital growth to labor growth was low, between 0 and 5.
Yes. The pie was growing rapidly, and everyone was getting a relatively fair slice.
And then the 90s hit, the Soviet Union collapses. The U.S. is the undisputed champ of the world again.
The end of history, as they called it back then. Debt to GDP was highly manageable, sitting around 50%. The internet was booming. It was a time of incredible balance.
The system was working exactly as it was designed to. Rebalancing the world, growing the U.S. consumer base, keeping everything stable.
It was peak abundance.
But then the music stopped. Or I guess the song fundamentally changed.
We reached the inflection point.
Roughly the year 2001.
Yes. If you really want to understand the K-shape we feel today, you have to look closely at 2001. This is where the old system began its demise.
What actually changed? Was it 9/11? Was it the dot-com bust?
Those were major catalysts, for sure. But the deep structural change was, once again, demographics. The boomers began moving from being labor-meaning active workers to being capital.
They became retirees.
Correct. They stopped relying on wages and started relying on their 401ks, their stock portfolios, and their home values.
Okay, so in a perfectly designed system, when that massive generation retires, the policy spotlight should theoretically shift to the next generation, right? The millennials, Gen Z, to help them become productive and keep the engine running.
That is exactly what should have happened. The system should have nurtured the next pig in the python.
But that's not what happened.
No. Instead of shifting focus to the young, the system continued to optimize for the boomers. But since the boomers were no longer labor, the policy shifted to heavily favor capital.
So we went from a mindset of abundance to a mindset of scarcity, from grow the pie to protect the assets.
You nailed it. We moved from growing the pie to protecting the assets of the old. And the data from Aquavis proves it conclusively. Remember that NSYNC ratio we talked about? Capital growth to labor growth.
Yeah, it was balanced, around 0 to 5.
After 2001, that ratio spiked. It averaged around 8, which is roughly double the prior era. Capital started growing way, way faster than labor.
And this ties right back to 1971, doesn't it? That capability to print money that we mentioned earlier, the gun they bought but didn't use.
Precisely. In 2001, they finally started pulling the trigger. This is the true birth of financialization and, frankly, the degradation of the West. The capability was finally exploited.
The feedback loop was officially broken.
Completely broken. We started using debt and money printing not to build new factories or fund research or upgrade infrastructure, but to artificially prop up asset prices.
And since the older generation owned all the assets and the younger generation completely relied on wages.
The K-shape was born. The wealthy, the people holding capital detached from the workers who only had labor.
Wow.
It wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of keeping the settings of the system focused on a specific demographic, even if that demographic's needs changed from earning wages to preserving wealth.
That is, man, that is heavy. It really reframes absolutely everything.
It changes the lens.
Yeah, because we aren't just dealing with a bad economy or greedy politicians. We are dealing with a system that is ruthlessly efficient at doing exactly what it is currently told to do, which is protect capital at all costs.
Which brings us to the big so what. Why does understanding this timeline matter to you, the listener, right now?
Well, I think it connects the dots. The K-shape we feel when we look at the price of groceries versus the stock market isn't just bad luck. It's the downstream output of prioritizing capital over labor for the last 20 years.
And it perfectly explains why things feel so incredibly volatile right now. You mentioned earlier that the system feels broken. Well, even the people running it know time is up. The source material points out that adversaries like China and even the Davos Collective are actively signaling that the old system is dead.
Wait, the Davos Collective?
Yeah, the Aquavis piece explicitly mentions figures like Friedrich Merz and Mark Carney openly saying the old macroeconomic order's gone. When the people who benefited the most from the system start saying it's over, you really should listen.
They know this 80-year cycle has run its course, so we've mapped the cycle. We saw the Post WWII birth in 45, the pivot in 71, the inflection point in 2001, and now the breakdown.
We're currently living through the intense friction of the old system dying. A system based on scarcity and capital preservation is unsustainable, and a new system is violently trying to emerge.
And that leads us to a final, pretty provocative thought for you to chew on.
Right. We spent this entire deep dive looking backward at the design of the past. But if the old system was defined by U.S. consumption and rest-of-world production, what does the new system look like?
That is the trillion-dollar question.
If the pendulum swung way too far toward capital over the last 2 decades, history says it must swing back toward labor. The question is, what does that actually look like for your daily life?
Does it look like massive reindustrialization? Does it look like a totally new form of money? I think we're already seeing hints of that with all the recent talk of tariffs and onshoring.
We definitely are. The tariff shock we are seeing globally is just the opening move of this new system trying to balance itself.
But I suppose that is a story for another day, because I know Aquavis covers that heavily in the future parts of this series.
They do, and we'll get there.
For today, the key takeaway is clear. Stop arguing about the symptoms. Stop shouting at the K-shape. Understand the initial design.
Exactly. Because when you finally understand the incentives driving the machine, you can stop being a victim of the system and start actually navigating it.
I love that. Order your mind. Harness your money. Shape your future. That's the Aquavis motto, and it feels extremely appropriate to end on that note today.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the design of the system. We'll see you next time as we continue to map the cycle.